Thank you. Well, I'm going to discuss or moderate the discussion around common structures in the Eiffel events. For those of you who didn't see my previous presentation, I'm Sven Selberg. I work as a source code management team lead at Access Communication at the tools department, together with Magnus and Niklas, you also heard from in the Eiffel community. So this kind of worms originates from the same effort to write a Eiffel event producing plugin for Gerrit that the previous talk around source change event structures. And in doing so, I believe Magnus also ended up finding out that I sort of structured the code so that I sort of wrote an SDK, Eiffel SDK, to use. And when doing so, I realized that the object-oriented modulation sort of hinted that some objects should be shared. For the most prevalent object is the meta object, which in my interpretation is metadata and is not linked, shouldn't be linked to any specific event type, but to the sort of imaginary type Eiffel event. And when I started looking into it, it showed that the meta type, from what I could see, had not diverged between events since Eiffel was open sourced. So it seemed like a good candidate. And links is a special type, since it's a list of types, type link, but the valid content differed between Eiffel events. And there's also some common data objects. I don't think we need to go over them, each and every one of them, but needless to say that there are many instances where several events share the same object or identical object that's not the same. But there's also instances where objects have, or events have objects that are named the same but are different. So for instance, test case finished, test suite finished, activity finished, all have an outcome field that is different between the events. And this is all fine until you come across object-oriented or object or type-oriented field domain, where this can cause some issues. But first of all, as a consumer of the specification, I found it unnecessarily difficult to comprehend, to sort of get a good comprehension of what the individual events was all about. For instance, there's a lot of if you can categorize the common events fields, it makes it an easier read for those who try to interpret the specification. I uploaded a change that would extract the meta into a separate type, and from the commit diff of that change, I removed 5,000 lines, and around 2,500 lines of those were markdowns. That is text that someone who's reading the specification wouldn't need to read. So that would, in my mind, make it easier to understand the specification if you categorize the meta object in this case. And when it comes to object-oriented spaces, most environments used for type of enterprise event structures are object or type oriented, or at least aware. And the basic basis for that is obvious to everyone. It's code reuse is one of those aspects. You only change in one place, not in hundreds. And if you don't reuse objects, then you have to sort of, to follow the specification, resort to copy pasting the same code representing the meta object into every event that you model in your code. I can't remember what I meant by adapting to new Eiffel versions. Let's skip that for now. But for type conflicts, for one example of type conflict where there's problematic to name, to have the same object specified in several events, it's the event repository, the GraphQL API. So the events are imported as JSON into Graphene, if I remember correctly, and Graphene protests on when the same field, or when a field is named the same in two different events. So this has the result that if you, as you can see, if you make the query for a source change created event, and in the query you state that data git identifier commit ID should be this, and in the response you don't get a git identifier. It's called source change created git identifier. And this is because Graphene refuses to specify the same object twice. If you would extract that into a type, then you could import that into Graphene, and Graphene would be happily call that field git identifier. Now you have to have a separate step to sort of interpret this response from Graphene into an Eiffel event. No, from Eiffel GraphQL API. Sorry. And there's also, the problem with outcome is basically the same, but the other way around, if that makes sense. And that's the base, I think, baseline, at least for the discussion. I know I had some pushback on that change I made where I extracted meta, but I think from where I'm sitting, it's extracting at least meta when the other types should be it's self-evident to me. Perhaps I'm have sort of a narrow look upon this, coming from an object-oriented developer background. But that's I think that could be a basis for a discussion. Floor is yours.
Great. I was thinking, Sven, maybe you can also mention some of the discussions that has been on GitHub on this issue that you wrote, because there is quite extensive discussions in there.
I don't know how to summarize those. Basically, they were quite extensive, as you say, but I don't think I'm the right person to sort of give to interpret the opposing views, so to speak, because I don't understand the reasoning behind them, which could possibly be because I'm not haven't been deep diving in the Eiffel community long enough. I don't know.
I can just make some comment on that discussion. I haven't really thought of the last parts of it, but initially I was around when the meta object was actually distributed into the different event types, or at least, or maybe no, it was only maybe the documentation part of it, the markdown part of it, that was distributed. Now I don't remember actually. But anyway,
I can check.
Yeah. So Daniel Ståhl was the one, as you know, who made the initial open sourcing of the protocol, and he also made the initial changes, or the changes the first years or so to the protocol mostly. And I know that he broke this up in all the different markdown files, at least. Maybe it was also in the JSON files by then. I think one of the reasons for having it in different JSON files at that time was because the JSON schema definition, or the possibilities in the JSON schema at that time, didn't really allow for having include objects in the same way as we see it might be possible now. So that might be one reason, but I totally agree on the duplication of both schema data, schema code, and the markdown code. That looks really silly. So I think I'm kind of pro extracting the meta, at least. But of course we need to make some good tests on it and see that it holds, of course. And
I mean, the resulting specification wouldn't change. It would just be sort of the intent behind it. So using the specification, you could be certain that you only had to look at one meta object when a new version of Eiffel is released, because the changes in that meta object reflects changes in all meta objects. In theory, if in the current state, when a new Eiffel is released, you would have to look at the meta object of every event to see if it changed somewhere. I think one of the explanations was that, if I remember correctly, that the meta object might diverge in the future. And that's why my interpretation of the meta object was that it was a metadata, and not if something was to be added to a specific event, it wouldn't be added in the meta field, it would be added in the data field. But as I said, I'm not fluent in Eiffel, so I might be misinterpreting that part.
It would seem. Go ahead.
Oh, sure, you go.
All right. It would seem weird, I think, to have different meta objects for different events. And if there, for some reason, would be such a need, you could probably solve that by adding a generic optional field that you could fill in for the exceptional event. I still think it sounds weird, but it's one conceivable way of solving that, whatever problem might be solved.
Or add a field that might be vocabulary. I'm lacking vocabulary. A field that's not necessary to be filled.
Yeah, optional, non-mandatory.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Yes.
I think one of the reasons that was brought up in the thread here was simplicity, and in one way it is, of course, simpler to. I mean, duplication is a way of avoiding complexity in some context, and sometimes that's a valid argument, other times not. So, I mean, for consumers of the schema, it's probably simpler to have self-contained schema files without any external dependencies. But it creates problem for documentation, and if you want to generate SDKs, and this ties back to the discussion this morning, because you end up with some weird things happening. While if you have explicit versioning of those, if there's separate entities that are separately versioned, you don't have that problem. But you do get the complexity of figuring out how do we deal with these entities, because they would have to be versioned somehow, and how would that work, and so on. So, yeah, and that adds complexity. I don't, to be clear, I don't think that complexity is a problem. It's something we could overcome. So to me, it's more a matter of finding something that actually works and doesn't create bad complexity, so to speak. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you have complexity, and however you solve this problem. The question is where would be the best place to place that complexity?
Yes. I mean, that's usual. If you're lucky, you can choose if you have a problem where you want the complexity or the drawbacks to be. And as someone who just recently added a field to all the link objects in all 23 events and updating the documentation, I will be very much in favor in centralizing the links object. That was a very, very big, annoying PR. Took hours to put together, including verification. So yes, I'm in favor generally, but we have to find something that actually works. To be honest, I haven't looked at all closely at your pull request, so I don't know how you dealt with versioning of the extracted meta. So that's maybe something that would have to be fleshed out.
It was a while back that I made the pull request, so I don't remember myself, to be honest. But I think I basically I think one of the discussion what if several event types have different versions of the meta objects? That sort of complexity, I think you can just say that shouldn't happen. So you could basically say that now we have this version of Eiffel, and then you set all the objects. And the problem is when you create a new version of Eiffel, if the meta object doesn't change, should you still refer to the old version of the meta object, or should you sort of claim that this version of the meta object is also this meta object supports two different versions of meta objects? But as you say, you could have the same commit could be tagged with several tags, notifying that this is used in this version and this version and this version. So I think it need not be as complex.
Yeah, I think we need to look into if the meta object should be kind of part of the event, meaning that each event states what version of the meta object it should hold, or that when you expand the event, you will also see the meta, or if it should be seen as something on the side that, well, to actually create a full event, you would get this meta from there, and you will get the rest of the event definition from there, and put them together yourself. And all of them have, of course, the same edition tag on them then.
I think I don't see why you would have to have one version of an event referencing a different version of the meta object, if that makes sense. So
no, when it comes to meta, I think you're right. When it comes to maybe other objects, like should we take the logs object or something like that, then it could be so that in one version of the protocol, some parameter could be outside the log object, and then for some reason we decide to put it into the log object or whatever, vice versa. And then of course it needs to match, so we need to know for the log object then, if that's a central definition of that as well. From what event version on should we use the new one and such things. But the meta is a very separate thing, I would say. It's a meta. It's just another layer of the event somehow.
I think you can solve the for instance, the Git identifier or WOBs or whatever in the same way. If you have a certain version of, if you receive a certain version of the event, then you would have the same version on the Git identifier object, and it's up to the consumer to check to see if those are actually the same object or not, if that makes sense. So you would have you would sort of tag all objects with the same tag. So if you receive an event of a certain version, you could be sure that all the objects had the same versions, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is related, but I found it. Yeah, my own personal opinion. I'm not invested in the Eiffel community yet, to the extent that it makes valid. I could make a valid point, but I feel that if you totally bogged down on the JSON schema, you could miss out on if everything needs to fit JSON schema. It's more complex. I don't know how to express this, but if you have an array of SDKs that sort of reflects the intention of Eiffel in its full, then the JSON schema complexity is not that big of an issue. If you do that make sense? It does. Looking at Magnus, I don't see it make sense.
I'm not good at hiding my feelings, am I? No, but
basically, if you have a good array of SDKs, then the complexity is behind them for any event creator or consumer or anything. It goes away, because you can just try to create an event and the SDK will tell you, no, this is not this. You can't have this link object, the link type on this event, or
yes,
this should have
no soup for you. No, but I think that's yet another good reason for having good SDKs, is that they can hide that type of complexity. And if we need to do some extra hoop jumping for validation to work, for example, well, fine. Sort of end user, consumers, producers, they're not supposed to be doing validation. That should be taken care of by good libriaries, basically.
Yeah. But they should still, of course, be able to read the documentation in a good way. And I don't think we should duplicate the event definition documentation into the SDK documentation. The end user should probably read the event definitions. So, of course, we shouldn't have duplicated data there, I think.
Yeah, but it's nice to have an SDK that you don't have to. You can try to do something, and the SDK tells you, no, that's not valid. So you don't have to actually. It's quite possible to sort of follow the specification in the SDK and give that SDK to a developer that understands Garrett or Jenkins or whatever, and that developer doesn't have to understand Eiffel. It only has to try to create events, and the SDK will tell you that that's the valid event, that's not a valid event. So that's basically how I built the SDK for the Garrett plugin that I worked.
Yeah, and the SDK could, of course, mirror the documentation as well. I mean, you could include all description fields and everything from the markdown or from the event definitions into the SDK as well, without rewriting it or copying it, more or less.
Yes. So this ties into the discussion we had the other week. I don't recall in which context. We were reviewing the Lyon pull requests and whether we should have. Right now, I mean, the markdown files are just plain text files, and we have the schemas, and they have to be synchronized manually. If maybe we should have we could generate schemas and generate the documentation based on some common representation that also could be used as input to SDK generation, for example, or something else. I mean, we don't have any machine readable representation of valid link types. So if you want to know the valid link types, you have to a human would have to parse the markdown file, and that's not fantastic either.
Yeah, I think I made a stab at link types in the JSON schema and did not make any progress whatsoever. But whereas in the Java SDK I wrote, it wasn't a big deal. It was just so it's the complexities of describing the schema. Same as I said before. But the benefits is that you could have you could sort of outsource the Eiffel parts to people who are good at Eiffel, and then give SDKs to people who are really good at the other areas you want to do Eiffel related development.
Yeah. There's a raised hand here.
Oh.
From Ahmed.
Yes, are you hearing me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, hello all. I just have a question regarding the versioning for the Eiffel protocol. As you have said that the events has its own versioning stepping other than the versioning for the protocol itself. I don't get the reason benefit from this point, as I see you discussing the complexity arised from this feature. Could you just elaborate on this different versioning between the events and the protocol itself?
Yeah, I try to remember now what was the reason. I don't know. In our legacy Eiffel, we had one version of the whole protocol and no individual version of the events. But when we open source it, we decided to actually set individual versions on each event type. And then, of course, we have the editions that group all these event type versions together now. Well, I don't know if someone else can help out finding why we have individual versions for the events now. Maybe it's too late in the afternoon for me.
It's okay. Just it's okay to answer this later. We could elaborate it in the versioning page on the GitHub for the Eiffel, because I am reading it multiple times to get the point, but I didn't get it well, as I think we are developing a .NET library for .NET, as Eric mentioned in that channel, Slack channel. So we're thinking in that if we support all versioning or just the Eiffel protocol version, then each version support multiple version from the event. So in a stronger type SDK or audit library, this has to be good thought to solve that. If we do that, for example, in like a web API could be versioning by URL, but in the scenario of .SDK or class library, the things are different. This is the point from this question. I am interested to elaborate more from the versioning reason to deal with this complexity.
I think from SDK perspective, it makes sense to have, to implement one edition of the whole protocol and not just implement individual versions of events. I mean, as soon as there comes a new version of one event, I don't foresee that the SDKs should update to that new version unless there is also an edition created where that version is included. Of course, for test reasons or something else, you could do it probably. But for officially released versions of the SDK, I think they should match to proper editions of the protocol. But still, I think anyway, it could be valuable to see in an event type, as we use the semantic versioning there, we can see if the events are themselves are backwards compatible or not. We can easily see now what events have changed between two different editions of the protocol and what kind of changes are made to the different events. Meaning, if you're a consumer to events, do you need to do some update, or, well, I'm just interested in these events and they haven't changed at all in this new edition, or they are backwards compatible changes only, and then it's good to see per event type what has actually changed, what kind of changes has been made. Maybe that's one argument for having individual versions.
Okay, I see. Thanks. One more question, please. The Eiffel or sub-protocol event may have one event one version for events. I mean, the one, for example, Paris edition Paris for the protocol supports the 4 version for the events, or at least the last version for the event included in this version. So I don't have to have different version for the event inside the Paris edition. Am I clear? Or I can rephrase the question again, as I see Magnus didn't get the question well.
I got your question because
I'll probably have to turn off my camera soon. No, but I think as Emil said, there is a benefit in having individual versioning of the events, because you can more easily track what kind of changes were made. Because if you would, it seems you're asking why not use the same version for all events that go into an edition, right?
No, my question is, for example, Eiffel activity start event in the Paris edition, for example, the version 4. So in this edition, we have only version 4 for Eiffel activity started event. That's right. there is, for example, two event support in the same Paris event.
So I guess what you're asking more or less is actually why do we see many different JSON schema versions when we look at the Paris edition of the protocol in the repository?
Yes.
That's, yeah. So of course, if you say that you are compatible with Paris, then you should be able to send events using the latest version that is seen in the Paris edition in the repository. And I kind of agree that it's kind of unnecessary to have the older versions still there when you look at the specific edition of the protocol. Because if you're sending events using Paris, you are expected to send them using the exact version that corresponds to Eiffel, not anything earlier. At the same time, a consumer that is compatible with Paris should probably be able to understand earlier versions of the protocol as well, or earlier editions of the protocol, and earlier versions of those events then, of course. Which relates back to the discussion we had earlier on how long should we support old editions. So I thought that's maybe something we should consider, if we should maybe even remove old versions in the source tree when we deprecate or stop supporting the old editions somehow.
I see that. I think that's a good idea to think. But for kind of backward compatibility, I think you are right from the supporting multiple version to a specific time or support time. Thanks for your answer.
But I think a consumer needs to be aware of multiple editions at the same time somehow. It needs to be able to understand multiple editions, at least if the events span organizations or maybe even smaller parts where there are multiple deployments of the producers and consumers, then it mustn't be so that all consumers and producers are always on the same edition. So the consumers should most probably be able to handle also older versions, older editions of the protocol.
Once you run Eiffel for a while, you will have links to older versions of the events eventually.
Sure. Exactly, yeah. Which in itself might be a problem if you do upstream, downstream searches and want to find a specific data or whatever in persistent stores. Good question, Ahmad.
Thanks.
So would the next step be to revisit the existing pull request and update it as needed and sort of do a more, it seems we sort of agree that yes, this is a good idea in general, but we would have to, dig into the details on how to actually implement it. And then review that.
One recurring comment in all of these discussions is how does this fit to SIG events then, to CDF? And I think it actually fits quite well, this thing as well, because as you might know if you listen to Matthias this morning, that SIG events or the event protocol defined there in CDF is based on cloud events. And the cloud event specification is to a large extent equivalent to our meta part of our definitions, our event definitions. The cloud event specification, of course, that's a specification of its own. So it has its own version, so to say, of the meta of their fields, which is then the meta in Eiffel terms. So it makes total sense to me, at least, to have a common meta definition for all events that is the same for all events in one edition of the protocol. It doesn't really make sense when comparing to them the SIG events definitions to have different meta definitions for different event types. So that's I would say it's in line with being compatible with SIG events, which is good. Kenneth, you raise your hand.
Yes, I have a question. So, I guess I didn't follow the whole conversation, since I'm quite new in the open source community as well. And then, I see the proposal. It seems like it's a little bit like non-backward compatible change, isn't it? You kind of move some of the data, remove it from the Eiffel messages, then maybe how do we handle that? Like if like your like a CI flow, you know, has been sending out a lot of like different messages with this event type, you know, like then like if we remove some part of it, and then like then will it become like a non-backward compatible? Then would it be like some of the legacy messages is in different format, and then the new messages looks completely differently? And then if you already have some tools which is already, you know, like dealing with the old Eiffel messages, the old version, then how should we handle that? I'm not too sure my question is valid or not. I didn't get the full thing, you know. So
I say that depends a bit on how we implement this. I mean, if we implement it in the way that one meta definition is the same for all event types in one edition, then we don't need to include the meta version in each event, which also means then that we could actually, that the events sent out on the bus could actually look exactly the same as they do today.
That was the idea behind the proposal, that the resulting JSON payload wouldn't be any difference.
Exactly. So it's the difference will be in the markdown in the documentation and also in the JSON schemas, but not in the actual JSON payloads, as Sven says.
Yeah, you could still treat the meta objects as separate, but they will never differ.
Yeah.
So the messages, it still looks exactly the same, but just that internally it is some of the implementation is different. Okay.
Yeah. So the meaning of the meta object is different, but it doesn't reflect the resulting objects events.
All right. Okay.
It would affect if you have any existing automatic generation, for example, the Eiffel RAM semantics generates a bunch of Java classes from the schemas. Those classes would end up differently, and that would probably be an incompatible change in RAM semantics. Plus, it could possibly be that they would have, it could be some incompatibility, because if they make assumptions that the schema files are independent or self-contained, then that would no longer hold true, because they would have to refer to the schema for the meta object, for example. So that kind of breakage would be expected, but for producers and consumers, no difference.
I wasn't able to generate the pojos in RemRem because I ran into a test that fails, that doesn't seem to be related to the actual change. I see now. But I tried.
It's good.
A question. You talked about this, that you couldn't have, you said that the data Git identifier couldn't be in multiple events. Did you say, or did I misunderstand you there?
I didn't
you had a slide on problems with having, you talked about the GraphQL.
Yeah. The problem in the GraphQL API is that you import the events from the JSON schemas, but Graphene interprets, for instance, first you import the source change created event, and then in that event you have what Graphene interprets as a Git identifier object, and then when you import the source change submitted event, it tries to create the same object again because it's named the same and it looks the same. I don't know I don't speak Graphene, so I don't know exactly what happens. But basically in GraphQL API, they need to first inject sort of new names for those parameters. So that Git identifier is called source change created Git identifier, when imported into Graphene. And that's why the response in turn doesn't have a data.get identifier. It has data.source change created Git identifier and source change submitted Git identifier.
So Graphene generates GraphQL data types based on the fields in the entities. And in this case, you have Git identifier, 2 fields, but they have, well, the definitions are identical, but they're not the same.
Exactly.
So if we would have extract Git identifier to a separate separate object definition, I'm sure Graphene would understand that, and things would suddenly just work.
Yeah.
And of course, you could claim that this is a limitation in the GraphQL API service, but it's, you know, any other implementation that would do something. I mean, it's more a problem in GraphQL. If you would try to generate GraphQL schemas for any kind of GraphQL service, you would end up in problems here, unless you somehow tell it that, yeah, this Git identifier here is actually the same as this Git identifier here.
Or name them separately.
Sure, yeah.
But it just points to that this will rear its ugly head once you enter into an object-oriented space in some way, possibly.
I mean, it doesn't have to be object-oriented. I mean, if you would generate a C library or a Go library, you would also have to either use the same, either define a Git identifier data type and you reuse it in both places because you know that they are the same, even though theoretically they could differ, or you would need to namespace those data types, prefixing them with the event name, for example.
No, okay, but I mean object type structure based.
Yeah.
But then it answered my questions that we would solve it by actually extracting this to the same thing, because then I guess Graphene, if they would read and see that both of them are pointing to the same object, they will say, okay, this is the same object actually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So how do we continue this then? What is the next step? Is it to update the pull requests then, or should we do some more investigation somehow first before you spend all that time?
I think I don't know how to update the review request because
maybe it's good enough already.
At least I would need someone doing a code review on it.
Of course.
I'm currently sort of stuck with this test not working, and I haven't got any feedback from Raja.
So based on our discussions now, you don't see any need to update the pull request, at least based on what you've said now?
No, I don't. Not to my knowledge. There probably is. It's probably not perfect, but I think this all has been addressed in the pull request.
Yeah.
And the rest is sort of processes how to version the various. The version discussion is I don't, perhaps separate. I don't know. I would like for someone to sort of review the pull request, sort of take it from there.
I think actually that Raja has left, so he might not be able to comment on this, but maybe you, Swati, could instead comment on this for his sake, or we can help out. Swati is more or less replacing Raja there in some sense. So yeah, we should review it. when it comes to this, the discussion on if we should have versioned centralized object or if they should be one per edition or like a general, just whatever we have and don't version them, just use them. Is that something we should discuss more, or do we think that we have a consensus on not needing to version the actual objects?
I think what I was trying to say was when I spoke about version, it was the sort of the addition. So if you have an event of a certain edition, then you know which meta object that event has, if that makes more sense. So the underlying versioning, I don't know if that, I don't have any opinion on that. But if you have an event of a certain edition, and then you know that the meta, what the meta object looks like and what all the other objects look like, then that should. I sort of think of edition as a release of Eiffel.
Yeah, it is in some sense. It is. Yeah. In most sense, it is, I would say.
So then the question is, if a consumer receives an event, should the consumer look at the version of the event itself, or is there additional edition tag it looks on, or how does the consumer know which metadata object it should look at, the version of it? I'm not asking if you need to answer a question, but it's more a general question, and we can leave it for later discussions if not possible to answer.
I don't know. In my mind, it's basically if a typical version of a meta object comes with the version of the specific version of an event comes with a specific version of a meta object. So it's I don't know. It's just the specification for the edition that the object corresponds to. In that, you should see what the meta object looks like. Perhaps I'm simplifying too much.
I guess that could work. In that case, I guess if we would update the meta object for next edition, we would have to step all the versions of all events. But yeah. That's a simple solution.
No, not necessarily. You have an edition. In that edition, the events. The event version, the event only has a reference to the meta object. So the event could basically be the same, but the meta object changed between editions. So you have the event has a reference to a meta object, and the event itself says that I'm edition Limoges, and then you know that the meta object is of revision Limoges, and you can use that one, and the event itself doesn't have to change. The version of the event, so to speak.
I think it would have to change because it's still the effective schema of the event would be affected by changes in the meta object. So
it depends on if you track the resulting schema in the events version, then yes, you would need to step up the version up. But if you interpret the version of the event as what is specific to this event has changed or not. That for example, for a consumer, if you only went by version, you wouldn't need to do anything anymore extra in parsing the data field, but you would have to use the new version of meta if you didn't want to follow a specific edition, so to speak. But if you follow the specific edition, then you only need to parse the events from that edition. And by looking at the difference between the two editions, you would see that the source change created event didn't change, but the meta object changed.
Yeah, but that would create ambiguity, because if you have a composition defined, for example, version 4.0.0.
But do you consume events of a specific version or a specific edition?
Well, what's specified in each event is the version. So if I receive an event, a composition defined with 4.0.0, that has to be, I must be able to unambiguously resolve that to a schema that I can use for validating it.
Okay, my bad.
So
it's my lack of Eiffel. I thought the versioning was the not the version but the edition. And then yes, you'd have to step up all the events if you change the meta object.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of similar if you have a class hierarchy, and if you make a change in the super class, make an incompatible change there, that would ripple down to all the subclasses, for example, even though those files didn't change, maybe. Or they are affected by the parents' changes, so they undergo incompatible changes. But I think the version there would have to. I'm not entirely clear on how that would work, so that's one of the things we'd have to consider in the review.
You could simply step the version up for each metadata change. But yeah. Seems kind of verbose, but it would work. But you would do that today also. I mean, there's no difference in like version. There's no versioning explosion by changing the schema. If you change the metadata object, then you change it in every event, and every event would have a new version. So it's not a new problem in that sense.
No, not a new problem. A better analogy might be a Git repository where you have submodules. If you bump the submodules, you get new commits in the, and that's not something you can. That's how things work. So
yeah, it's a really good fitting analogy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in that case, yes, it would affect the versioning, and changing the meta object would change the version of every Eiffel event, same as today.
Yeah.
When doing this extraction of the common object, is meta the primary object we should look into as the guinea pig for this? I mean, it will be a new way of dealing with our schemas and well, in RemRem generating the POJOs and everything we have there. I was thinking if it would be easier to make like a smaller pull request, a smaller change on say the Git identifier object or some, I don't know, some other logs object or something like that, just to decrease the blast radius, let's say, if things screw up, and to make the work of updating a pull request multiple times less. Does that make sense? Or even though the meta might be the most hurting parts that we actually want to extract as soon as possible.
Yeah, definitely. On the other hand, if there are any, if we want to discover anything that might ruin the day for us, meta would be a perfect place to start, because we could definitely gain success with Git identifier, and then we reach the meta object, and then things just blow up for us because something we didn't consider there.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I think that makes sense. What Magnus said, you should try to burn the entire house down, and if it then you know if it's possible or not.
And then doing the same thing for Git identifier would just be a simple exercise.
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah. I think that would make meta a good candidate, because it would touch all the corners of life, so to speak.
I mean, I noticed one thing by looking at the pull requests. You've created a new Eiffel meta property directory with a 1.0.0.json file. I can actually why describe what I'm seeing when I can share instead. So this is the definition of the meta property, and this makes sense here to have an enum that lists all valid events, except that if you want to have it's totally valid to define new Eiffel events, and suddenly you can't do that if you want to reuse this meta definition. So such things should probably have to be considered as well.
Yeah, then you would have a version explosion. You would create a new event, and every event would need to get a new version because the meta object changed.
Well, that too, but I mean, if you you have the Eiffel operations extensions, for example, that define additional Eiffel events, those couldn't use this meta definition because those events aren't listed here. So this would probably shouldn't be an enum, but probably just be a string.
Yeah, we should rethink when we talk about extensions, how we should deal with those. If we need another, I mean, we haven't officially granted any extensions, some kind of production status yet.
Yeah, but if you can't, if the definition is that any event could inherit, could be the type, then yeah, making it an enum doesn't make sense. But then it's just too strict verification, what you should call it currently. But that's why it needs review.
Yeah.
I've only sort of copied what I've seen. Perhaps all that I've seen is not valid, and perhaps I've interpreted things wrong.
And we also have the version there.
Yeah, it's just one solution. Perhaps there's other ways to solve it.
Yeah, so the version field would need to be a more generic string there, or regex, instead of a dedicated version in each meta JSON file.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
As I said, it's most likely not the perfect solution, but it's one attempt at it.
Yeah, of course. So we should review it, of course. It totally makes sense. Okay, 1 minute left to the full hour, and the summit. Great discussions. I'm overwhelmed, I must say. Nice. So any final comments on this subject, or should we wrap up? Yeah, let's wrap up. Matthias, you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to, I could try to do some ending. Thank you everybody for attending. So this is the last session. And if you want to, you can go into the poll that I posted here in the chat and fill in so we can have some feedback on this summit for next summits. Any ending words, Emil, Magnus?
I just pasted a thank you, and you have the links that you would need, I hope, in that thank you message. If you saw me writing during the last conversation, that was what I did. Preparing for that. So thanks everyone for attending. I'm super happy.
Yeah, thank you. And keep in mind the monthly community meetups once every month on Thursdays. So if you want to have more discussions like this, you're very welcome to join or suggest topics for that matter. So I think the next occasion is on October 14.
Yes, and do sign up to the Google group so you will be part of the mail list so that you don't miss up any mails on the April community if you haven't already.
And I think we will have another summit probably in the spring, possibly physical. But we'll see.
If there's interest in the community, there will be. Yes. Okay. Thank you all then. And see you in a channel somewhere.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.